Chapter 69. The tornado she had been sucked into may have disappeared, but a reasonable amount of momentum from the spin remained, transferred to the wooden boat Ray now sat in. It was tricky to buck and sway with the combination of the waves and the boat's rotation in the water, and the stark contrast in the light had temporarily blinded her, so it was impossible to anticipate the boat's movements. Squinting under the savage glare of the sun, Ray clattered off her low bench and onto the deck, where she clung on to whatever solid objects presented themselves. The sea dragged on the boat's hull, slowing its spin after only a few turns, and the whirlpool of frothy water around the boat soon dissipated into the broader swells of the open ocean. Ray's eyes adjusted to the stunning daylight, and she sat up, shading her brow. The double ender was about 20 foot long and open to the elements. Its wood a rich brown with dark patches and old coats of oil flaking off. The hull was patched here and there with small sections of planking fixed fast with square-headed rivets. Every surface was shabby with seaweed, fish scales, and diesel. Pulling herself up with the long wooden tiller, Ray clambered up onto the worn bench at the stern. What was that all about? She wondered. Echoes of remorse and anguish still resonated within her, their sad tugs a little lighter, but still present. And in the throes of that feeling, it had been quite clear what she'd mourned. The thing was, and it wasn't easy to admit this, but the thing was that regardless of what happened, however it all stacked up in the end, she missed him. The man with the cloven thumb. She really did. Sure, Ray desperately needed him to infiltrate these fucking directors. Okay, the whole situation was creepy. Yes, she might actually be brain damaged, psychotic even, but there was something about him. He knew her like no one else, a witness to all, a companion she'd never lose. Or had she? The open ocean around her was still and empty. Which direction should she take? Such a sudden and drastic shift in setting was unusual for a metastasis simulation, but then this was neither your average cluster nor your average simtech. Chugging away before her, a waist-high metal box housed the inboard motor. At the base, a few stubby metal levers stuck up from the deck, presumably the controls for this mechanical dinosaur. And on top of the metal housing stood a decent-sized fishbowl, its water still sloshing about in circles, with a single globular fish spinning unsteadily in the swirling water. As everything steadied and the boat and the water in the bowl found their equilibrium, the fish finally controlled its spin. Flattened laterally, it was almost perfectly round, silvery grey and smooth, tall as it was long. It resembled the head of a fish with just a tail and no body. Two long fins protruded from its rear, one up and one down. Its pursed mouth gave it a permanently surprised look. The fish blinked its pebble eyes at Ray. "Blimey," it said. "That was an experience." Okay, thought Ray. An archetype. In the absence of Mr. Thumb, she had nothing better to do than engage with it. "Yes, it was," she replied. And who might you be? Some people call me sunfish. Others call me moonfish. Which do you prefer? Clump. All right then, Clump. Where's the action around these parts? Oh, that's easy. The fish swivelled around in its bowl and pointed itself to starboard. That way. Sweet. Sounds good. And what's going on over there? Can't say for sure, but if anything is going on, it's going on over there. That's the centre, you see. The centre? Oh, yeah, definitely. That way to the centre. Okie dokie, Clump. Ray booted a metal lever with her foot, and the engine kicked into gear. She swung the tiller around, and the double ender chugged off in the direction the fish was pointing. As the boat turned onto its heading, Clump swung around and kept his bearing, smooth as a compass needle and just as clear. So, how long until we get to this centre, then? Ray asked, raising her voice above the motor. The boat was not exactly speedy. Clump glanced back at her. Oh, not long. About 5 minutes or so. Be there soon. The old diesel inboard thrummed on with a reassuring put, 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 as the boat lolled this way and that, rolling with the swell. Ray's gaze settled on the horizon. Slight imperfections in its line were just visible as heavy rollers tumbled along in the far distance. Loose strands of seaweed drifted past the boat occasionally, as did the odd jellyfish, creamy and yellow. Ray checked the time on her eyeline. 10 minutes had passed. How are we doing there, Clumpy? Close yet? Oh, it said, the surprise in its voice now congruent with its expression. The fish seemed to be thinking, checking something, listening, perhaps. We've gone past it. Sorry. It's actually, he swivelled around to port. That way. My apologies. Don't know what happened there. Not too far, though. Just a slight correction. Ray shrugged and pulled the tiller behind her, rolling over the shoulder of a wave. The boat swung around. She checked the direction of the bow with the way Clump was facing and squinted into the wind that now blew into her face. There was nothing obvious in this direction either, but she held her course. The minutes passed. The waves rolled by. An impatience nagged at her, but she gave it little credence. Realistically, there was little else she could do other than follow the lead of her fishy navigator. Events would gather themselves eventually. It was a process. In the meantime, she took in the view. Ray thought about her old friends and Lance and the choices she'd made since the academy. She'd known Lance had liked her back then. Couldn't have been more blatant. So what put her off? She supposed she'd wanted everything to stay the same. A slight twitch in Clump's tail brought Ray back from her reverie. Ah, Clump said, with regret. Don't tell me. Yes, I'm sorry. I can only apologise. This is getting embarrassing, but we've gone past the centre again. The fish turned to face Ray and tilted itself humbly. I think it was all that spinning around earlier. I do feel a bit queasy, and these waves aren't helping. Maybe I'm seasick. Could be messing with my sense of direction. Seasick? Clump, mate. You're a fish. Well, fish don't usually spend their time rocking up and down on boats. It's horrible. Yeah, I see your point. You ought to live in the sea, not bobbing around on the surface. What if I popped you in the water? Maybe you could swim on and lead me to the centre." "In there?" He looked overboard and down at the waves. "Are you sure it's safe?" Ray thought about it. "Honestly, no, I'm not. But nothing ventured, nothing gained." "Well, okay then, if you're sure it's safe." With a grunt, Ray picked up the bowl and placed it on the edge of the boat. "Oh, as I said, I've really no idea." She poured him out into the ocean, and after the froth subsided, Clump nudged his face up above the surface. "Oh, it's cold in here," he said, with a shiver. "Refreshing?" "Yes, actually. So, the centre." He dipped down a little and turned a few quick circles before resurfacing. "Yeah, you were right. So obvious. This way. Follow me." He swam along the hull to the bow. Ray waited until he was a few metres ahead so she could see him, and then kicked the boat into gear and set off behind her guide. Coasting along with the steady rhythm of the sea, the waves threw the bright sunlight into random collages that glinted and glanced into her eyes. She held a hand up to shade her view and tracked Clump's progress with a squint. Thinking about the past again, Ray tutted to herself, shaking her head. God, she'd been such an idiot. She chuckled to herself. At least she could laugh about it now. The laughter dried and caught in her throat as she looked about her, suddenly alert. Clump had disappeared. Ray couldn't remember when she'd last seen him exactly. Slowing the boat, she looked all around in case she'd overtaken him by accident. Nothing. Putting the motor into neutral, she went all around the gunwale and checked under the curve of the hull, calling his name into the water. He was definitely not here. Right then, she shrugged. Alone in the open ocean, without her fishy guide, without Mr. Thumb, without a chance of completing the covert work she'd been tasked with. Well, it was all pretty much out of her hands. There was no point getting in a panic about things she had no control over. As expected, this simulation was not working out. With little better to do, Ray checked the sun's position and the direction of the wind, then roughly figured out where she'd come from and swung back around on that heading. It wasn't long before a thin wisp of smoke discerned itself from the pale blue of the sky, and she steered towards it. In a sudden bloom, the slight wisp turned into a thick black funnel of smoke belching up from the sea. A few 100 metres from its source, Ray just made out the flat form of a wooden raft, bobbing about in the waves. Yellow flickers of flame danced at one end, clearly out of control, while the silhouette of a person stood at the other end, bending their legs and leaning into the rock of their simple craft. Given the choice, Ray would have gunned the motor faster, but it was already putting along at full speed. She pushed down on the lever that served as the throttle, but it wouldn't budge any further. With her eyes trained on the burning craft, Ray saw who the unfortunate castaway was by the time she was 20 metres away. Long auburn hair, that wiry frame. It was him, at last. The man with the cloven thumb held a spear of some sort and was picking at a lump of something he'd skewered at one end. Ray pulled up a few metres behind him and cut the gas. He hadn't noticed her yet. The roar and crackle of the burning raft were so noisy, he couldn't hear her approach. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called out. Fancy a lift then, do you? Mr. Thumb turned round and beamed at her. He chewed on a mouthful of food which sprayed in all directions as he called something back to her. She couldn't make out a word he said. Going as slowly as possible, Ray brought her boat alongside where he'd stationed himself in the last flame-free part of the raft. It would not remain flame-free for long. Reaching an arm out, she helped him aboard, then put some distance between them and the blazing collection of logs now completely engulfed. He offered her the charred lump on the end of his spear. I said, have you had any lunch? It was a fish. A round fish. Flattened laterally, about as tall as it was long. Don't tell me that's Clump. He wiped his mouth, greasy with fish oil. It is. Any good? Fucking lovely. Well, she shrugged. Go on then. Why not?